Freedom Camp Number 4 sat on a repurposed military base 40 minutes outside Baltimore, and the name was a lie in the way that only Vought could make a lie feel patriotic. There were no flags at half-mast. Cameras covered every corner of every building, and the guards wore body armor printed with the Sevens logo on the left breast, and the intake processing center smelled like bleach over something older that bleach couldn't quite reach. Huey Campbell had been inside for 11 days. He knew it was 11 because Mother's milk had scratched a mark into the concrete beneath the bunk every morning since the second day when it became clear that counting was the only ritual left that Vought hadn't taken from them. The first day, MM had been too busy cataloging injuries. The second day, he'd started scratching. 11 marks, now thin lines in the gray wall that the guards either didn't notice or didn't care about. Frenchie sat cross-legged on the floor between the two bunks, turning a plastic spoon over and over in his hands. They'd taken everything else on Intake Phone's tools, the small folding knife Frenchie kept in his left boot. But plastic spoons were apparently below the threat threshold. Frenchie had been treating his like a chess piece for 3 days, moving it from hand to hand, studying it the way he used to study detonators. "Stop that," M said. "It helps me think. It's giving me a headache." Frenchie set the spoon on the floor, picked it back up, and kept turning it. The block held 42 people. Huey had counted those too, though the number kept shifting. Sometimes someone was moved out at night and no one came back in their place, and the remaining inmates learned very quickly not to ask the guards where they'd gone. The block was designed for 30. The extra 12 slept on the floor on mats that smelled like mildew and institutional disinfectant. Outside the barred window, the floodlights were on. They stayed on all night, pointed inward at the yard, which meant everyone in the block slept with orange light cutting across their faces. Vaught's official communications described the lighting as a safety measure for detainee welfare. There had been a press briefing about it. Huey had seen the clip on a monitor in the processing hall before a guard noticed him watching and switched it off. "You think Annie knows where we are?" he asked. MM didn't answer immediately. That was its own kind of answer. "She knows Frenchie said. "Annie always knows." "Knowing and being able to do something about it are two different things," MM said. He was lying on his back, on the bottom bunk, staring at the ceiling, with the particular stillness of a man conserving energy on purpose. "Right now, we are not the priority. Right now, staying quiet and not giving them anything to charge us with is the priority." "They don't need charges," Huey said. "No," MM agreed. "They don't." The facility operated under emergency executive authority. That was the phrase in the authorization documents, the ones that had been signed and filed and cited in 3 separate press conferences as the legal basis for holding 42 people without formal charge in a repurposed military installation outside Baltimore. Emergency executive authority. Clean language for a dirty arrangement. The overhead light clicked off at exactly 2200 hours every night. The floodlights outside stayed on. The difference between light and darkness in Freedom Camp Number 4 was a matter of direction, not degree. Huey had stopped being able to sleep past 4 in the morning. He lay on the top bunk and listened to the sounds of 30-some people breathing in a space built for fewer, and he thought about Annie, and he tried to do the math on how long they could stay here before something changed for the worse. He hadn't come up with a number he liked yet. The incident started at 11:47 in the sub-level technical facility that didn't appear on the camp's public-facing schematics. Vought R&D had been running a classified project for 8 weeks. The internal brief called it containment optimization. 2 clean words that said nothing about what they were actually trying to contain. The project lead, a systems engineer named Petra Schultz, had transferred from the Bioweapons Division 6 months prior. Her mandate in plain terms test whether a biological sample recovered from the Godolkin incident could be used to suppress compound V-derived abilities when integrated into the camp's security grid. The sample was in a sealed cryogenic unit in the southeast corner. It had been extracted from a subject who was no longer alive to object. For 6 weeks, it had behaved according to its measured parameters. Then Schultz's team pushed the integration one step further, cross-wiring the sample's electromagnetic signature into the camp's primary power system, and the sample stopped behaving according to anything measured. The short version Vought had plugged something they didn't understand into a system they thought they controlled. And at 11:47, the system stopped agreeing with that assessment. The fault cascaded in under 4 seconds. A power surge hit the emitters in the sub-level walls. The cryogenic containment field flickered. The air in the southeast corner tore open. There was no better description than that it simply tore like a seam, giving way, and emitted a sound that Schultz would later describe in her incident report as a resonance failure producing a spatial distortion of unknown duration and scope. The emergency lights kicked on. The cameras recorded 4 seconds of static. When the static cleared, there was a woman in the corner of the room who had not been there before. She was crouched when she arrived, one knee on the concrete right hand, on the hilt of a sword. The blade caught the emergency lighting, long, straight, clearly real. And then it didn't. A shimmer of compressed air wrapping the steel until the weapon registered as a distortion rather than an object. She held position for 2 full seconds, eyes moving across the sublevel in a sweep that cataloged every person, every camera, every exit. Then she stood. She was slight in a way that made the sword look wrong until she moved, and then the sword made sense. And everything else in the room seemed slightly misplaced by comparison. The armor she wore, articulated plate over a blue tunic, should have looked theatrical in a concrete utility room. Instead, it looked functional, and the room looked inadequate. Her hair was pulled back tight, the color of old gold, and her expression was the expression of someone who had woken up in unexpected situations before and developed a protocol for it. "Lower your weapons," she said. The 2 guards did not lower their weapons. She fixed the nearer one with a steady, measuring regard. "I am not your enemy. I do not know this place. Lower your weapons and no harm will come to anyone here." The guard's finger was on the trigger. She tracked it with a patience that wasn't calm exactly, more like the stillness of someone who had already mapped every outcome and was waiting for reality to select one. He fired. Center mass good instinct, tight form. The round struck the compressed air barrier around the sword and deflected, punching into the wall, 2 feet to her left. She closed the distance before his finger reset, not away from him, into him inside the weapon's angle, her left hand redirecting his wrist with a precision that used his own momentum and put him on the floor without fracturing anything. She held the wrist for 1 additional beat after he landed, then released it. The second guard had his weapon on her head. "I told you," she said. She wasn't looking at the gun. "I am not your enemy." He lowered it. The certainty required to keep it raised had gone somewhere he couldn't locate. She turned to the cryogenic unit, the scorched concrete, the wrecked equipment. Studied the damage without touching anything. Then she moved the tip of invisible air, just the point a hair's worth of focused wind pressure along the cryogenic unit's access panel, until the latch gave with a soft click, confirming what she'd already understood. The thing that had brought her here had come from inside that container, and whatever it was, Vought had been trying to weaponize it. "What is this place?" she said. Not a question directed at anyone in particular. An accounting, nobody answered. Nobody had an answer that covered the full scope of what she was asking. The alarm activated at 11:51. Block C's lights snapped to full intensity, the automated protocol for a security incident, and 42 people went from fitful sleep to vertical in under 5 seconds. Huey was on his feet before he was fully awake, pulse spiking in the way it had learned to spike over the past 2 years. Was already standing head tilted, reading the alarm's pattern. Not a fire alarm, said. Rhythm's different. Perimeter breach, Frenchie offered. Something internal. Through the barred window, Huey could see 2 guards crossing the yard at a jog, not toward the outer fence, but toward the administration building, toward the sub-level access stairs. The radio chatter outside had the particular pitch of people receiving instructions from someone who was also receiving instructions. Something internal, confirmed. They waited. It was what was available to them. At 12:03, 7 cameras in the yard sector went dark for 40 seconds. The duty officer logged it as a glitch tied to the sub-level incident. He was partially correct about the cause. He was entirely wrong about what happened during those 40 seconds. What the dead cameras missed was a woman in armor crossing the yard from the sub-level access point toward the outer blocks. She walked without hurrying, which at a distance read as authorization purposeful, no evasion, no urgency. 3 separate guards registered her and processed her as someone who belonged there. This was a failure of imagination rather than perception. She stopped in front of Block C. The guard at the door was 23 and 6 hours into his shift. He saw her, registered the armor and the sword, and started to challenge her. She raised one hand, a signal wait. She tilted her head and listened. Inside the block, Huey heard nothing from outside but the alarm and the camp's ambient hum. He was watching the door when the lock moved, not the electronic bolt that was still sealed. The physical deadbolt, the secondary mechanism, turned. She was working it from outside, a thin blade of channeled wind pressure threading the mechanism with the patience of someone accustomed to locks designed to different tolerances than these. The door opened inward. She stood in the frame. Behind her, the guard was seated on the ground, with the calm of someone who had been put there cleanly and had decided not to test whether the second attempt would be equally clean. She took in the 42 people taking her in. Her gaze moved from face to face and came to rest on She said nothing for a moment. "Who holds responsibility here?" she asked. "Among the prisoners?" Stepped forward. She surveyed him, registered the scratch marks on the concrete wall. The mildewed mats, the bodies in a space built for fewer, and something shifted behind her eyes, brief and controlled the way pressure changes before weather arrives. "Among those held in this place," she said, "how many bear no part in whatever conflict brought them here? People who were taken, not captured." "Most of them," said. "All of them," Frenchie said. "Unless defending yourself from being murdered counts as picking a side." She held Frenchie's gaze for a moment, then returned to "Where are the other blocks?" Told her. He gave her the layout without asking who she was, or where she'd come from, or what her angle was. Because the calculation was simple, she had opened the door, and everyone behind that door had been sleeping on wet mats under orange lights for 11 days, and no one in the room was hurt. She nodded once, turned back to the yard, walked. The alarm was still running. 3 more blocks waited. Huey looked at "We just gonna stand here?" "No," said. "We are absolutely not." He picked up Frenchie's plastic spoon from the floor, some reflex about not leaving things behind, and held it out. "Let's go." Dog. By the time the duty officer reached the yard with 6 additional guards, Block C was empty. Block D was empty. Blocks A and B were clearing fast, a stream of people moving toward a gap in the inner fence cut with a precision that left every camera mount intact. Deliberate, the officer noted. Whoever had done it wanted the footage. He reviewed it later. The woman in armor moving through his camp with the unhurried focus of someone solving a familiar kind of problem. She went from block to block, door to door, and spoke only to ask directional questions. How many in this block? Where is the medical unit? Which direction is the road? She disarmed the guards she encountered, put them on the ground without injury, and moved on. Not one person in her path was seriously hurt. Not one. His incident report would describe the event as an organized security breach by one or more individuals of unknown origin utilizing unknown methods to compromise multiple structural access points. It would not mention that his guards weren't hurt, because describing that accurately would require him to explain what he'd seen on the footage, and he didn't have language for it that fit inside a Vought incident report. The first camera crew arrived at 12:41, 7 minutes after the Starlight Resistance's encrypted channel broadcast the first clip. By the time the Vought News Network crew arrived, the framing was already in place. Not a liberation, not a breach. An attack. A terrorist action against a lawful federal detainment facility operating under emergency executive authority. By 6 in the morning, the hashtag was trending. By noon, there would be a press conference. By the evening cycle, 3 pundits would be arguing about whether the attacker was a foreign asset or a domestic extremist, and none of them would have seen the actual footage. The camp's logo burned above the entrance when the broadcast went out. Freedom Camp Number 4. Below it empty, 42 detainees gone. By then, the woman in armor was 7 miles north on a highway's shoulder, sitting alone on a concrete barrier. And the people she'd walked out ahead of her were scattering into the dark in 2s and 3s. She sat with her hands open in her lap, studying them. Both of them. Turning them once. 42 people, 4 blocks. 1 camp, 1 night. She thought about the dimensions of a kingdom, not the myth of Camelot, but the count of it, the actual number of people whose lives had run inside the radius of her decisions. She had believed once that a different choice at the beginning would have changed the math. That the problem had been the person holding the sword, not the nature of the thing the sword was meant to protect. She was less certain of that now. This was a different world. It had the same problem. The problem was not small, and the camp behind her was one piece of it, and she did not yet know the shape of the rest. She stood. She turned east toward the light pollution of a city that wasn't sleeping. And she thought one camp is not the system. One night does not settle a war, and whoever built that thing in the sub-level, whatever they thought they were building, they had reached further than they knew, and they would want to know what came through. She started walking. Behind her, the floodlights of Freedom Camp Number 4 were still burning, aimed at an empty yard, 4 empty blocks, 42 empty mats. The cameras were still recording. In a few hours, someone would review that footage in a building with a very large logo on the outside, and this conversation that followed would not be about what had gone wrong in the sub-level. It would be about how to make the story useful. The first Vought press briefing began at 6:17 in the morning, which meant the talking points had been drafted before dawn, which meant someone in the communications division had been awake at 3 a.m. Running scenarios, which meant Freedom Camp Number 4's emptying, had triggered a protocol that already existed. You don't write a crisis playbook in 4 hours. You pull it off the shelf. You pull it off. The spokesperson was a woman named Donna Rhodes. Corporate affairs, impeccable blazer. The kind of practiced composure that reads as grief on camera. She stood behind a podium in Vought Tower's press room and described the previous night's events in language so precise it left no room for a different version of events to take hold. In the early hours of this morning, she said, an armed individual of unknown origin conducted a coordinated attack on a federally authorized public safety facility outside Baltimore. Multiple security personnel were assaulted. Detainees held under emergency executive authority were forcibly removed from protective custody. She paused. We want to be clear, the individuals in Freedom Camp number 4 were there for their own safety and the safety of the American public. Last night, that protection was stripped away. Protective custody. That was the phrase. It ran on VNN every 11 minutes for the next 4 hours, paired with freeze frames from the camp's security footage, the sword, the armor, the angle carefully selected to cut the moment the first guard fired. In the broadcast version, the guard's shot came out of nowhere. In the broadcast version, the woman in armor attacked first. By 7:40, the hashtag had fractured into 2 camps. The original hashtag, Freedom Under Attack, and a countertag hashtag, Who Opened the Doors, that the Resistance's broadcast network had seeded at 6:02. Vought's digital team had the countertag demotion request filed with 3 platforms by 7:15. 2 complied within the hour. The third took until noon, citing review processes. At 8:09, a man on a cable news panel described the woman in armor as almost certainly a foreign deployed tactical asset, possibly enhanced, possibly not even human in the conventional sense. The host nodded. The other panelist, a former Vought security consultant, said the attack bore hallmarks of coordinated anti-government extremism. Neither of them had seen the unedited footage. The unedited footage was in a secure server farm in Northern Virginia by 6:30, tagged for restricted access, and the duty officer who had reviewed it had signed an NDA by the time his replacement shift arrived. The guards who had been in the sub-level signed NDA as before they left the building. The technicians signed ND as before they were put on a company shuttle to an undisclosed location for debriefing.
Time.
Petra Schultz, the project lead, signed 3 separate documents and was told that her project was being reclassified to a level that precluded her from discussing it with anyone, including her own team. The sub-level itself was sanitized by 9 a.m. The cryogenic unit was transferred to a secure site. The scorch marks on the concrete were documented, photographed, and then painted over. The incident report that went into the official system described a structural anomaly of undetermined origin and made no mention of spatial distortions, resonance failures, or women in medieval plate armor. Vought did not know what had come through that opening. They knew it was strong. They knew it had walked out 42 detainees without killing anyone. And they knew that the footage of it doing so was the single most dangerous thing in their possession. Dinah Rhodes was still at the podium when the order came down to reclassify the unedited recording as a national security asset. By 10:15, an official request had been filed to have it designated as classified federal evidence, which would take the decision about its release entirely out of Vaught's hands and put it into the hands of people Vought had a better working relationship with. At 10:30, the first piece of Vought merchandise appeared on its official store. A shirt, navy blue, blocked letters, Protect Freedom. Below it, a small 7 logo, $14. It sold 11,000 units before noon. Mother's Milk had them moving by 12:15 in the morning, before the first news van arrived, before the hashtag existed, before Vought had decided what to call the woman in armor. He'd spent the walk from Block C to the gap in the fence, running the same calculation he always ran in bad situations. Who is hurt? Who can move? Who needs to be separated from who? Nobody was seriously hurt. That was the first surprise. The guards they'd passed on the way out were sitting against walls or fences, or each other disarmed, unhappy, completely intact. The woman in armor had moved through the camp like someone running a clearance operation against targets she had been specifically ordered not to damage. The second surprise was that she'd disappeared before they reached the road. He'd noticed it at the gap in the fence. She wasn't behind them anymore. No announcement, no explanation, just absence. He filed it. There were 42 people to move, and a window of maybe 30 minutes before the camp's backup systems came online and started tracking phones. "Phones," he said. "Everyone who still has a phone, leave it. Drop it right now, right here, and keep walking." There were arguments. He didn't engage with them. People who were going to argue about their phones were going to argue regardless, and the ones who kept their phones would be found, and that would be their lesson. 23 people dropped their phones in a pile at the edge of the road. 19 didn't. He made a mental note of which direction the 19 walked. He moved the 23 northwest, keeping to the tree line, covering ground fast enough to matter and slow enough not to lose anyone. Frenchie ranged ahead and to the sides, which was what Frenchie did when he was processing. He needed to be useful with his hands and his eyes. Or the anxiety came out sideways in the ways that slowed everyone down. "There," Frenchie said, pointing. A strip mall parking lot, 3 cars, 2 of them, with unlocked doors he'd identified by some method chose not to ask about. The blue one is older, no GPS module. The gray one, I am not certain about the gray one. "Blue one," said. "Get as many as will fit." "It is a Civic." "Then get as many as will fit in a Civic." They moved in 2 waves. Frenchie took the first group in the Civic, 4 people, absolutely the limit, and held the rest, rotating them through contact points. He was pulling from memory numbers he'd memorized before the camp. Because Annie had told him to memorize numbers before the camp. Because Annie had been preparing for the camp the way Annie prepared for everything. By assuming it would happen and making the downstream decisions in advance. He thought about Annie. He thought about the fact that she already knew or would know within the hour, and that knowing wouldn't make it easier. He pulled out the emergency contact, a number he'd written on the inside of his left forearm in ballpoint, before the arrest covered for 11 days by a long-sleeved shirt, and he waited for a borrowed phone. Huey was next to him, not talking, which was unusual for Huey. He had the look of a man who was running calculations of his own and not getting results he liked. "She's fine," said. "You don't know that. I know she was running an operation before we got picked up, and I know she's still running it, and I know she knew exactly where we were." He paused. "Whether she's fine is a separate question, but she's running." Huey nodded. He looked back at the tree line, at the direction they'd come from, at the empty stretch of highway in the pre-dawn dark. "The woman?" he said. "Saber, or whoever she is. What about her?" "She didn't come with us." "No. Why not?" Considered this. He'd thought about it at the fence, and he'd thought about it on the walk. And he'd come to the same place each time someone who moved like that, who assessed like that, who asked about civilians before she asked about exits. She wasn't running. She was watching. She was mapping the shape of the thing she'd landed in before she committed to a direction. "She's not done," he said. Frenchie came back with the Civic at 4:45 and 3 additional vehicles he'd acquired from a contact he declined to name. By the time the first news van reached Freedom Camp number 4, the road north of the camp was clear. The last of the 23 were moving. Frenchie drove the final leg himself, one hand on the wheel, the other drumming a pattern on the door. He'd been thinking about the woman in armor since the moment she'd walked through the blocked door, and thinking about her had produced a specific kind of mental friction. He associated with encountering things that didn't fit his existing categories. He knew how to read a fighter. The stance, the economy of movement, the way the eyes tracked, he'd spent enough time around people who did serious violence to know which ones were performing and which ones were operational. She was operational in a way he'd never seen. Not exactly. The closest reference he had was a particular kind of specialist he'd encountered once in Lyon. A man who'd fought in 4 different conflicts on 3 continents and moved through a room the way water moves through a space, not forcing, just finding the path that was already there. She moved like that, but cleaner. Like the calculation was faster than he could follow. Like she had already been through the room before she was in it. "You are thinking about her?" Hugh said from the passenger seat. "I am thinking about many things." "Your face is doing the thing it does when you're thinking about one specific thing." Frenchie glanced at him. "She is not from here," he said. "Not from this country. Not from this..." He gestured vaguely at the window at the highway, at the pre-dawn sprawl of Maryland. "This era." Huey said nothing for a moment. "You think Vought knows what she is? Vought knows what they saw on camera." He tapped the wheel. "They will decide what she is. That is different." On the radio, the Civic's ancient AM receiver, static-edged a morning show host, was reading from what sounded like a prepared statement about the attack on the Freedom Camp facility. "Armed extremist, unknown origin, threat to national security." The host's voice had the particular grave but collected register of someone who had been handed language and told to treat it as his own. Frenchie turned the radio off. Annie heard about it at 3:47 in the morning, 17 minutes after the Resistance Channel's first broadcast. She was in a basement in Silver Spring with 4 people she trusted and a laptop that bounced its signal through 7 different nodes. And she watched the clip, 38 seconds of shaky phone footage, clearly shot through the gap in the fence, and she watched it twice, and then she sat back and breathed. The clip showed the woman in armor walking across the camp yard, unhurried. The sword at her side, that shimmer around the blade that made it look like a tear in the air rather than a weapon. Behind her, a stream of people following. Annie knew every face in that stream. She had the list. She had been updating the list for 11 days. She pulled up the second clip, 6 seconds different angle, lower quality shot on something old enough to have a shutter sound. And this one caught the woman's face for a fraction of a second as she turned toward the fence. Young looking, but not young in the way Annie was used to. The kind of face that seemed like it had decided something a long time ago and hadn't reopened the question. She forwarded both clips to a secure server, flagged them, and added a note, "Unknown. Not Vought. Not ours. Assess." Then she pulled up the VNN feed, watched Dana Rhodes describe the woman as an armed extremist, and felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has been fighting a media war long enough to recognize every move in real time. "Armed extremist," said the man to her left, Todd, former Starlight volunteer. Good instincts, bad at sleeping. "They're burning the frame fast." "They had it ready," Annie said. "They've had it ready. Anytime something happens, they can't explain the frame is already built." She closed the laptop. "Get me a line to MM's emergency contact, and find me everything we have on the camp sub-level." "We didn't know about the sub-level." "I know we didn't." She stood moving to the small window at the top of the basement wall, the narrow strip of pre-dawn gray outside. Find out why. The question of who the woman in armor was, where she had come from, what she could do, what she wanted, was a question Annie was adding to a list that was already very long. The more immediate question was simpler. Vought had lost 42 prisoners, lost the camp's credibility as a symbol of control, and lost whatever was in that sub-level. They would need to replace all 3 losses with something that looked like a win. Whatever came next was going to be designed to look like a win. She pressed her palm flat against the cold basement wall and thought about a woman walking across a floodlit yard without hurrying, and the people behind her who were free now, and the system that would spend the next 72 hours making that freedom into the crime. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten over silver spring gray, going pale at the edges. And somewhere on a server in Northern Virginia, the unedited footage of Freedom Camp number 4 was being reclassified, and the Vought store was getting its first bulk orders on the Protect Freedom shirt, and Dana Rhodes was preparing for her second press briefing of the morning. The frame was built. The question was whether anyone could break it before it hardened. Homelander addressed the nation at 9:14 in the morning from the steps of Vought Tower, which was not a government building, but had been designed to look like one, all vertical stone and the kind of scale that implied permanence. The crowd had been assembled by 6 a.m. Not bussed in Vought didn't do that anymore. Not since someone had documented the bus manifests, but cultivated word pushed through the right channels to the right people, so that by the time the cameras went live, the plaza held several hundred faces that wanted to be there, which was a more durable image than faces that had been paid to be there. He wore the suit, not the tactical version with the reinforced plating. The performance version, the one photographed 10,000 times, the one that read as authority from 40 feet and patriotism from 100. He stood at the top of the steps with the city behind him, and he looked in the framing Vaught's production team had constructed like a man who had built that skyline himself and was prepared to defend it. Last night, he said, a terrorist attacked a facility where American families were being protected. People who had been removed from harm's way for their own safety and for yours. He paused. He was good at pauses. The individual responsible is armed, enhanced, beyond anything we've encountered in the field, and operating with what we believe is foreign backing. Another pause. I want to be clear about one thing. I will find her. And when I do, every American watching right now will see exactly what happens to people who think they can come into this country and hurt the people I protect. The crowd reacted the way the crowd was supposed to react. VNN ran the speech 4 times before noon. Each run included the same package of supplemental footage: the camp's entrance, the empty blocks, the freeze frame of the sword. The word terrorist appeared in the lower third graphic for the duration of every broadcast segment. By 10 a.m., Vaught's tip line had logged over 2,000 calls. By 11, a reward had been posted, $100,000 for actionable information, leading to the identification of the attacker. By 1 in the afternoon, that figure had been quietly doubled through intermediaries rather than official channels, because the official channel had a paper trail and the intermediaries did not. Checkpoints went up on 17 major corridors in Maryland and Northern Virginia. License plate readers, facial recognition rigs. 3 Vought aircraft running grid patterns at altitude. The operational order described the target as enhanced armored carrying an edged weapon of unusual design, potentially capable of deflecting ballistic rounds. Someone in the tactical division had written a risk assessment. The risk assessment was classified. Its conclusion was that standard engagement protocols were insufficient, and escalation authority had been elevated 2 tiers above field commander level. Translation: nobody engages without sign-off from above, because nobody knows what happens when you do. She had been in the city for 3 hours when the broadcast aired. Baltimore in early morning had the specific texture of a place between states. Not night, not quite day, streets half populated with people who were up because they had to be, and no one else. She had walked east from the highway, and then southeast, following the density of buildings, the logic of a city organized around water and commerce. She was drawing attention. The armor was not built for concealment, and she had not yet found a solution to that problem, which joined a list growing faster than she was resolving it. She stopped at a gas station on a corner in East Baltimore, because the window held a television mounted high on the wall, visible from the forecourt. And the television was showing a man in a red and blue suit standing on stone steps with the city spread behind him. She stood at the window and she watched him speak. She could not hear the audio through the glass, but she had spent enough of her existence studying the posture of rulers to read the architecture of the performance without it. The placement elevated, backed by verticality, crowd below. The cadence legible from the movement of his jaw, pauses timed to reaction. The expression, not anger. Anger belonged to people who felt threatened. What she was reading was more calculated than anger. A man who had decided the most useful emotion available to him right now was righteous grief and was deploying it with precision. She watched until the segment cut to a news desk, and then she saw the freeze frame herself crossing the camp yard. The chyron below it read, "Freedom Camp Terrorist, Armed, and Dangerous Reward Offered." She considered this for a moment. Then she went inside, bought a bottle of water and a bag of chips with money she had taken from a wallet left on a fence post. She had left equivalent value in a folded note, which the clerk found later and spent some time puzzling over, and she stood at the counter and thought. The man on the steps was the apex of the system she had arrived in. That much was legible from 30 seconds of mute broadcast. The way the crowd deferred, the way his words became the lower third graphic without qualification, the way terrorist sat below her image as settled fact, these were the marks of a power that had made itself synonymous with legitimate force. Anyone who moved against it became illegitimate by definition. She had encountered this mechanism before. Not here, not in this form, but the structure was not new. She finished the water, pocketed the chips, and walked back into the street. She needed height, and she needed the people she had pulled from the camp because they understood this system's terrain better than she could map it in 3 hours. She needed both before the man on the steps found her on his schedule. She preferred to choose the ground. He found her at 2:17 in the afternoon at a checkpoint on Route 40, which was not coincidence. Vaught's aerial grid had flagged a thermal signature inconsistent with civilian profiles moving southeast through Baltimore's eastern corridor. And the flag had climbed the chain fast enough to reach Homelander while he was still in the production van post-broadcast. He landed in front of the checkpoint barrier. Clean descent vertical, the cape settling in the downwash. 2 tactical units stepped back to give him room. The cameras, 3 of them, VNN crew stationed at the checkpoint since 10 a.m., were rolling. She was 30 yards up the road. She had stopped. He walked toward her with the gait of someone accustomed to space rearranging itself as they moved through it. He stopped at 10 feet. "You've had a busy night," he said. She said nothing. He took her in the way he took in everything he was planning to deal with, running the numbers on the gap between what she was and what he needed her to be on camera. The armor was real. The sword was real. The fact that she was holding his gaze without any visible shift in register was, he would admit to himself later, unusual. Most people, even most soups, produced some signal when he closed to 10 feet. She produced nothing he could categorize. "You're going to come with me," he said. "We'll have a conversation in front of the cameras. You'll explain to the American people why you attacked a federal facility and released dangerous individuals into the public. Then we'll discuss who sent you." "No one sent me," she said. "Everyone's sent by someone." "Then your model is wrong." He took another step. "You want to try something? I've been curious since the footage." "I have no wish to fight you." "That's not what I asked." Oh, she held his position with the steadiness of someone who had stood in front of harder problems and made clean decisions about them. The people in that facility were held without charge. They posed no threat that justified their confinement. I removed them. That is the complete account of what occurred. The complete account. He let a beat pass. She thinks she gets to define what occurred. He angled slightly toward the cameras without looking at them, the practice performer's pivot. "You hear that?" He moved. Heat vision tight beam into the road surface 6 inches from her feet. A demonstration calibrated, the kind of thing that said, "I can place this wherever I choose." The compressed air sheathing her sword arm shifted. The beam deflected along the wind barrier's surface and discharged into the asphalt 6 feet to her left, scoring the road in an arc. He stopped. She had not moved her feet. "You turned it," he said. The broadcast cadence had dropped half a register. It was more reaction than he usually gave. "I did not attack you," she said. "I will not. But I will not absorb a strike either." He recalibrated. She could see it, the slight postural reset of a commander revising an estimate without appearing to revise it. She had watched the same adjustment in warlords and kings and people who led armies, the moment when the initial assessment proved insufficient and the real thinking started. "Here's where things stand," he said, the performance register restored. "By tonight, you'll be on every screen in this country. The story attached to your image will be whatever I decide it is. Because that's the architecture here. You have no network, no communications team, no political cover." He tilted his head a fraction. "You have a sword. I have everything else." "Then you have enough," she said, "to leave the civilians alone." Something crossed his face, not quite surprise, not quite the species of rage he was accustomed to reaching for. He was not used to people receiving existential leverage and responding with conditions. 4 civilians at the checkpoint. A family in a minivan stopped at the barrier, watching through the windshield. She had registered them when she stopped. She had been tracking them since he landed. If this exchange deteriorated past a certain threshold, they were the element with the least protection. He followed her sightline to the minivan. And then, because he understood leverage with a precision that was almost structural, he understood exactly what she was waiting, and he stored it. "You care about them," he said. She gave him nothing. "Good," he said. "That's useful." He stepped back. Deliberate. Unhurried, the withdrawal of someone who had decided that leaving served his position rather than anything having compelled him to leave. He rose slowly enough that all 3 cameras captured the full ascent. "Tell the world hi," he said, and was gone. The VNN segment at 4 p.m. ran 58 seconds of checkpoint footage. In the cut version, the deflection was removed. What remained showed Homelander arriving, exchanging words with the suspect, and departing. The lower third read, "Homelander makes contact with terrorist investigation ongoing." 3 tactical personnel filed independent incident reports describing the deflection accurately. All 3 were reclassified as sensitive operational documents before 5 p.m. The 4th officer, who had been nearest the exchange, took a personal day. Vaught's digital team submitted takedown requests for 11 pieces of civilian checkpoint footage, 6 of which had captured some portion of the deflection. 8 requests were honored within the hour. The threat classification on the Freedom Camp attacker was revised to maximum. The escalation authority moved up again. The operational note read, "Target demonstrates capacity to redirect standard and enhanced energy attacks. No engagement without Homelander-level authorization." In a safe house in Silver Spring, Annie watched the 4 p.m. segment, then pulled the raw feed her network had captured from a civilian's windshield camera at the checkpoint. She played the deflection 3 times. She played Homelander's face in the half-second after. She played him clocking the minivan. "He's going to use civilians as leverage," she said. Todd didn't argue. She pulled up the Resistance Network's contact tree and worked through it systematically, redistributing safe house assignments, moving every node that had been stationary for more than 72 hours. When she finished, the network's map looked nothing like it had that morning. Then she drafted a message for a channel the woman in armor had no way of knowing existed to an address she had no way of accessing with a single line at the top. "We need to talk before he selects the next target." She had no way of knowing if it would reach anyone. She sent it because the alternative was stillness, and stillness was the condition Vought was trying to impose. Outside the city ran its evening, the way cities did delivery routes. Commuter traffic, people moving through their lives, and on every bar screen and living room television, the graphic held threat level maximum. Report suspicious activity. The reward figure glowed below it, patient as a trap. The frame wasn't just constructed now. It was structural, and somewhere in it, a woman in armor was choosing her ground. And a man who could burn a road with his eyes had just learned the one thing about her that he intended to use. Annie found her by triangulating three things. The fence footage, the gas station clerk's description passed through a contact in East Baltimore, and the pattern of Vaught's aerial grid, which had been running tighter circles in a 4-block radius near the port for the past 90 minutes. Where Vaught tightened the target had already moved. She back-calculated from the grid's edges, not its center, and came up with a warehouse district 2 miles southeast. She went alone. Todd had argued against it. She'd listened to the argument and gone anyway because bringing a team meant bringing risk to the team. And if the woman in armor decided this was a trap, more bodies didn't change that math. She parked 3 blocks out and walked the last stretch hood up, moving like someone with a destination rather than someone looking for something. The distinction mattered on a street with cameras. The warehouse was abandoned in the specific way of buildings that had been sold 3 times and renovated twice and were currently between uses. She pushed through a side door that had been left unlocked recently. She could tell from the position of the latch and stood in the dark interior for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. "You found me faster than I expected," said a voice from the far end of the space. Annie didn't reach for anything. "You left the door open." "I left it unlocked. There is a difference." She could make out the shape now, seated on a low concrete ledge armor on the sword leaning against the wall beside her. She wasn't tense. That was the first thing Annie registered. She wasn't holding any kind of alert posture. She was sitting the way someone sits when they've decided the space is secure and chosen to be still for a while. "You're Starlight," the woman said. "Annie, here." A beat. "Artoria, though the name will mean nothing to you." "It doesn't," Annie said. She crossed the warehouse floor and stopped at a distance that was close enough to talk and far enough to move if she needed to. "How long have you been here?" "Since before the grid tightened." She glanced at the high windows, the light angle. They are methodical, but they search from fixed assumptions. The asset is moving there for track movement. They do not consider that an asset might stop. Most assets keep running. Most assets are running from something. I was waiting for you. Annie studied her. The footage hadn't fully conveyed it the way she occupied space, like someone who had decided exactly how much of the room was relevant to her and was monitoring only that. Not paranoid. Precise. "We have a problem," Annie said. "Several manimyum," Artoria said. "Name the one you mean." "You freed 42 people last night. By tonight, Vaught will use that number to justify detaining 400. The camp is a symbol for them. Every time it gets hit, they rebuild it bigger and call it necessary. You didn't break the system. You gave it a reason to expand." Artoria was quiet for a moment. "I am aware that one camp is not the sum of it. Are you aware that your face is on every screen in the country right now with the word terrorist under it? I saw the broadcast." "Then you understand that anything you do next, they'll frame before you finish doing it." "I understand that they will try." She picked up the sword not in any threatening fashion, more the way someone picks up a tool they're considering using, and set it across her knees. At the checkpoint, the man in the suit told me the story would be whatever he decided. I don't dispute his capacity for that. But a story requires an audience, and an audience can be reached by more than one account. Not when one side controls the distribution. Annie sat down on a crate because standing for this conversation felt performative and she was too tired for performance. "You deflected his shot. Someone filmed it. Vought had the footage pulled from 6 platforms in under an hour. The clip that survived is 12 seconds bad angle doesn't show the deflection clearly enough to be definitive. She paused. I've been doing this for 4 years. They are faster at killing the truth than we are at telling it. Then we tell it differently. How? Artoria turned the sword once in her hands. When I rode into a contested territory, I did not announce myself through heralds. I arrived at the point of need. The people present became the record. She held Annie's gaze. The people you freed last night are the record. 42 accounts. Each one contradicts the version being broadcast. 42 people who are currently scattered and terrified, and most of whom don't have lawyers, and none of whom will be believed over Vought News Network. Not today, Artoria said. Eventually. Annie felt the particular exhaustion of someone who had been arguing with idealism for long enough to have lost the energy for it without having found a replacement. A kingdom run on fear doesn't last, she said partly to hear how it sounded coming from someone else. Is that the argument? Artoria's expression shifted, something contained, briefly visible. I have seen how it ends, she said. Yes, that is part of the argument. Then before Annie could respond, but eventually is not a plan. Tell me what the plan is. That was when Annie decided she could work with her. She laid it out flat, the way she laid things out for people she was going to trust, with operational information, no preamble, no softening. The camp was not simply a detention facility. The sub-level had been running an R&D project Vought was now actively concealing, which meant it had value, which meant they would either restart it elsewhere or retrieve whatever was left of it before anyone independent could document it. She had a contact inside Vought's logistics chain who had flagged a transfer order, the cryogenic unit, and its contents were scheduled to move within 72 hours. Beyond the sub-level, the camp still held approximately 40 detainees from a second block. That the initial breach hadn't reached a population, Vought had quietly moved during the overnight chaos, relocated to a holding facility adjacent to the main structure that didn't appear on any public record. 40 people, Artoria said. She was not asking a question. Give or take, the number changes. Then there is no discussion. She said it without heat, as simple arithmetic. We go back. We go back with a plan, or we don't come back at all. Annie kept her voice level. They have doubled the security perimeter. They have elevated your threat classification to the point where field commanders need direct authorization to engage you, which means they'll be waiting for a pretext to bring Homelander in directly. If we walk in without timing, without an extraction route, without a way to document what we're doing, so they can't bury it, Vought wins the story and 40 people get transferred somewhere nobody can find them. Artoria absorbed this without visible reaction. What do you need from me? I need you to be a problem they can't solve quietly. Which means you operate when we're already managing another crisis, when they're in front of cameras trying to hold a different frame together. They can't do 2 things at once. When will that be? Homelander is planning a press event at the camp. A reclamation, he goes back, he walks through the empty blocks, he talks about rebuilding. It's scheduled for 48 hours from now. Annie watched her. They'll be entirely focused on the optics. Every camera on him, every PR unit managing the image. That's the window. Artoria nodded once. The decisiveness of it was not impulsive. It had the quality of a decision that had been made before the conversation started, waiting for the information to confirm it. There is one other thing, Annie said. The man with the virus. Annie didn't ask how she knew. His name is Butcher. He's on the same side as us, technically, in the sense that he wants Homelander gone and Vought dismantled. And the virus. It targets compound V biology, kills soups. All soups, there's no version of it that's selective. She kept her tone factual because the facts were sufficient without her editorializing on them. He believes it's the only solution that works. He's wrong. I know he's wrong. The problem is, he's not wrong about the scale of what we're facing. He's wrong about the price being acceptable. Artoria was still. Outside, somewhere distant, a siren moved through the city and faded. A weapon that cannot distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. She said, is not a weapon. It is a verdict against everyone. She set the sword against the wall, again a deliberate motion. This man, he will use it regardless of what I think. Probably, unless something changes his calculation. What would change it? An alternative that actually works. Annie stood because they had run out of time to sit. That's why we need the camp, not just the people inside it. What's in the sub-level, if we can get it out and document it, we have something Vought can't classify. Evidence that holds. The kind that makes the 42 accounts mean something. She zipped her jacket. Butcher wants to end this with a match. We want to end it with a case. Those are the same goal from two different directions. And if he lights the match before you finish building the case, Annie didn't answer that. She picked up her bag and moved toward the door. The press event is in 48 hours, she said. I'll have an extraction route and a documentation team by tomorrow night. Can you stay out of Vaught's grid until then? I have managed so far. At the door, Annie paused. She wasn't sure why, some instinct about things that should be said before they became irrelevant. You pulled 42 people out of that camp and nobody died, not even the guards. She looked back. I've been in this long enough to know how rare that is. Artoria held her gaze with the same settled quality she'd had since Annie walked in. The guards were doing a job they were permitted to do by a system they did not build, she said. That is not innocence, but it is not the same as guilt. A pause. I try to make that distinction. Annie nodded. She didn't say anything else. She went out through the unlocked door and back into the city where the grid was still running, and the cameras were still turning, and somewhere on a logistics manifest, a transfer order was ticking toward its deadline. She called Todd from the car with the window-cracked air coming in cold off the harbor. She's operational, Annie said. Get me the extraction blueprint for the secondary holding block, the one adjacent to the main structure, not on the schematics, and get me Butcher's last confirmed location. Butcher's been dark since Tuesday. Then get me his last confirmed location as of Tuesday and work forward from there. She watched a Vought patrol vehicle roll through the intersection ahead and turned south. He's going to surface when he hears about the press event. He always shows up when there's a camera. What do we do when he does? She thought about a woman in an empty warehouse holding a sword across her knees and talking about the difference between a verdict and a weapon. We make sure he knows there's another option, she said. Whether he takes it is his problem. She hung up and drove. 3 blocks north, she passed a bus shelter with a Vought public service poster on it. Blue and gold, the 7's insignia, report. Suspicious activity in clean sans serif type. Below the text, a hotline number. Below the number, a small print disclaimer, reward program administered by Vought International. Terms and conditions apply. She had stopped reading those posters a long time ago. She read this one anyway, all the way to the bottom, because sometimes it was useful to remember exactly what you were working against. Terms and conditions. As if the whole arrangement were a subscription service. As if the country's safety were something you could cancel with 30 days' notice. She kept driving. Butcher arrived at the safe house on Wednesday at 11 p.m. with a duffel bag. and the specific kind of quiet that meant he'd already made his decisions and was here to inform the room of them rather than negotiate. Annie had been expecting him for 2 days. She'd known he'd surface when the press event leaked. Butcher always moved toward the camera, not because he wanted to be seen, but because cameras meant crowds, and crowds meant chaos. And chaos was the environment where his kind of solution became viable. She'd positioned herself accordingly, 2 exits, no phones within 30 feet, and Artoria in the far corner where the light was bad, and the angle from the door was wrong. Butcher dropped the bag on the table, pulled out a chair and sat. He took in Artoria the way he took in most things that didn't fit his existing categories, with a flat assessing patience that wasn't curiosity and wasn't hostility, just processing. "So you're the one who walked out the camp," he said. "I am, Sim," she said. "Nice work." He turned to Annie. "She coming with?" "That depends on what coming with means." He unzipped the bag. Inside, packed in foam inserts, were 6 sealed containers, the kind used for biological transport, the kind that required 2 signatures and a chain of custody form in a world that still had functional regulatory agencies. 48 hours, he said. Homelander's doing his little photo walk through the empty blocks. Vaught's going to have every camera in Maryland pointed at the camp. While they're all watching him, we seed 3 distribution points upwind of the facility. Wind takes it through the security perimeter. Anyone on site who's running V-biology starts symptomatic within 6 hours. He set 1 container on the table. By the time they figure out what happened, it's already in the ventilation. Annie studied the container. She'd known about the virus since Butcher had first surfaced it 3 months ago, and she'd spent 3 months telling herself they'd find another way before it came to this. "The press event has civilian press," she said. "Camera crews, journalists. Journalists aren't soups." The virus doesn't discriminate between journalists and Vought security if someone's carrying V in their system and they don't know it. There are people walking around with trace V from contaminated water sources in 3 Maryland counties. She kept her voice flat. Collateral. Acceptable collateral. To who? To me. He said it without flinching. Homelander has a soup army. You want to fight a soup army with 42 traumatized civilians and a medieval cosplayer. Or you want to end it? Artoria spoke from the corner. "The clean kill is not always the fastest," she said. "And the fastest kill is not always clean." Butcher turned to her. "That's supposed to mean something." "It means a weapon that cannot tell the difference between the guilty and the innocent has already lost its moral authority before it is used." "Please." She was seated with the same contained stillness she'd held since he walked in, not tense, not performing calm, just present. "You described a plan that kills indiscriminately in exchange for a fast result. I have heard that argument before. The person making it was wrong then." "Yeah, who was that?" "Someone I worked for. Someone whose methods I spent years in opposition to." She held his gaze without pressure, the way someone holds a position without leaning into it. He was not wrong about the scale of the problem. He was wrong about the price. Butcher was quiet for a moment. Then, "You saved 42 people. Tomorrow they'll cage 400. Next month, 4,000. At what point does your code authorize you to stop counting and start solving? When the solution does not require me to kill the 4,000 to prevent the cage. And if there's no version that doesn't require that, then we have not looked hard enough." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Right. 48 hours, and we haven't looked hard enough." He turned back to Annie. "I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you the timeline so you can get your people clear." Annie had been watching both of them with the attention of someone trying to hold 2 separate calculations in her head simultaneously. She put both hands flat on the table. "Stop," she said. "Both of you." Butcher waited. Artoria waited. "Billy?" She used his name deliberately, the way she used it when she needed him to hear her rather than his own certainty. "The virus has a dispersal problem you haven't solved. I've seen the data. In an open-air environment with variable wind, your 3 distribution points have a 60% probability of reaching the civilian residential area half a mile south of the camp before they reach the facility perimeter. That's not acceptable collateral. That's a massacre with our fingerprints on it. Then we adjust the points. You've adjusted the points 4 times. The math doesn't change." She kept going before he could answer. "And when Vought finds the dispersal mechanism, and they will find it because they will be looking for exactly this, they will use it. They will replicate it. They will have a bioweapon with our DNA on the delivery system, and they will deploy it against every resistance network in the country and call it counterterrorism." She let that sit. "You don't end Homelander with this. You give Vought a gift." The muscle in Butcher's jaw worked once. He wasn't dismissing her. She'd spent enough time watching him to know the difference between when he was shutting her out and when he was actually thinking. "So, what's your play?" he said finally. "The sub-level." She laid it out the same way she'd laid it out for Artoria, the transfer order, the 40 detainees in the secondary block, the documentation window during the press event. "We go in while Homelander's performing. We pull the people and the contents of the sub-level. We document everything on site with a chain of custody that Vought can't classify after the fact because it'll already be distributed." She tapped the table. "That's the case. That's the thing that holds. Not a body count, a record." "A record," Butcher said, with the tone of someone tasting a word they find inadequate. "A record against a man who controls the military, the media, and the most powerful soup on the planet. A record that 42 people corroborate. That sub-level documentation corroborates. That 3 independent journalists who will be at that press event can corroborate if we get them the right footage at the right moment." She met his eyes. "You want to burn the house down. I want to put what's in the house on the front page of every paper that Vought hasn't bought yet." His Butcher fixed his gaze on the container. He held it there for a long time. "The press event's in 48 hours, he said. "I know. If your play doesn't work, then we have a conversation about backup options with full information. Not before." Another silence. Outside, a truck moved through the street, its headlights cutting briefly across the high windows and gone. "The 40 in the secondary block," he said. "Vaught's moving them before the press event. I picked up chatter transfer orders, been accelerated. They're not waiting 72 hours anymore." Annie felt the calculation shift. How accelerated? 24 hours, maybe less. He zipped the bag closed, but left it on the table, which was Butcher's version of a concession, not removing it, but not opening it again either. "You want your documentation window. You've got 1 shot at it. And it's tomorrow night, not the press event." Artoria had not moved during any of this. She spoke now, directing it at Annie rather than Butcher. "The 40 people in the secondary block. If the transfer executes, where do they go?" "Somewhere without a public record," Annie said. "Then we go tonight." Butcher almost smiled, which was as close to approval as he gave anything. "See, the medieval cosplayer gets it." "Do not call me that," Artoria said without heat. "Noted." He stood, picked up the bag, held it for a moment. "I'll be there with this." He shifted his attention to Annie. "I won't use it unless the thing goes sideways past the point of no return. That's the only condition I'll agree to, so don't waste time arguing for more." It wasn't enough. Annie knew it wasn't enough. but it was what was available which was the permanent condition of every decision she'd made in the past 4 years. "Fine," she said. "But I define past the point of no return, not you." Butcher considered this. 50-50, he said. 70-30.
Was
60-40. Done. She hated that she'd just negotiated the terms under which a bioweapon might be deployed, as though she were settling a contract dispute. She hated that it was the right call. Be at the Eastern Service Road by 2200. No phones, no drones. He left without another word. The doors settled behind him. Annie stayed at the table. Artoria remained in the corner. "He will not honor the 60-40, Artoria said. "I know." "Then why agree?" "Because agreeing bought us 24 hours where he doesn't act unilaterally." She started pulling up the camp schematics on her tablet, the secondary block layout, the service road approach. And because the alternative was him going in alone tonight with that bag and no coordination. She pulled the extraction blueprint and set it on the table between them. The secondary block was 200 meters from the main structure, accessible from the Eastern Service Road camera coverage on 3 sides with a blind spot at the northeast corner that she'd identified 2 weeks ago and had been waiting for a reason to use. "Tell me what you see," she said. Artoria crossed the room and studied the layout with the focused attention of someone reading terrain. She pointed to the northeast corner. "Here, the blind angle. That's your entry. And the 40 people inside, what condition? Unknown. Minimum 11 days, probably more for some of them. They'll be able to move, but not fast. Then we need time, not speed. A slow extraction that looks like nothing, rather than a fast one that looks like a breach." She traced the service road with one finger. "If I go in through the corner while your documentation team enters from the south, the cameras will catch your team and ignore the corner. Vought will look at the south approach." Misdirection. I prefer to call it tactical priority. The closest thing to dry humor Annie had heard from her. "Your team gets the sub-level documentation. I get the people." Annie held the blueprint for a moment, then shifted her attention to the woman across the table from her. This person who had arrived through a tear in a Vought sub-level 11 days ago. Who had walked 42 people out of a cage and then sat in a warehouse waiting to be found. Who had just spent 20 minutes in a room with Billy Butcher and come out the other side with her position intact. "We move at 2200, Annie said. "I will be ready." Annie rolled up the blueprint. She thought about the 60-40 she'd negotiated and the bag on Butcher's shoulder and the 40 people in a block that didn't appear on any public record. She thought about a Chiron threat level maximum. She thought about terms and conditions. "One more thing," she said. "When this is over, the documentation, the people, whatever we manage to get out, Vought will still be there. Homelander will still be there. The system doesn't end because we win one night." "I know," Artoria said. "I need you to know it going in, not after." Artoria was quiet for a moment. The warehouse was still the city outside doing its city things, indifferent and continuous. "A kingdom does not fall in a night," she said. "But it begins to fall the moment its people stop believing the fear is permanent." She picked up the sword from where it leaned against the wall. "Give them that belief. The rest follows." Annie nodded. She didn't know if she believed it. She knew she didn't have anything better. 2200. The Eastern Service Road. 40 people in an unmarked block. She started making calls. The call came at 1940 from a source inside Vaught's logistics chain who had been feeding Annie information for 8 months and who communicated exclusively through a dead drop protocol involving a specific forum thread about vintage motorcycles. The message was 4 words: cleanup team en route. Annie read it twice, then pulled up everything she had on the camp's secondary block. The floor plan, the guard rotation, the service road approach, and ran the math on how long en route meant given Vaught's Baltimore logistics hub. 2 hours, maybe 90 minutes if they pushed. She called MMM. "We're moving now," she said. "Not 2200, now." A beat. She could hear him already adjusting. How long? 90 minutes before their team arrives. Less if traffic's good. Frenchie and I are 15 minutes out from the service road. Artoria. Already there, MM said. She's been there since 1800. Annie closed the laptop. "They're not transferring the detainees," she said. "They're cleaning them up." The silence on the line had a specific weight to it. "Go," she said. "I'll coordinate from mobile. Document everything." Frenchie had the service road mapped in his head, the way he mapped every approach entry. Exit cover positions, the 2 cameras with a 14-second rotation gap, the chain link section at the northeast corner that had been installed 3 months after the original fence and used different hardware than the rest of the perimeter. Different hardware meant different tolerances. He'd noted it on the first drive-by 2 weeks ago and had been waiting for a reason to be grateful about it. He was grateful about it now. M cut the chain with bolt cutters at 1958, and they were through the gap and moving along the fence line before the rotation gap closed. 4 members of Annie's documentation team came through behind them, carrying equipment in bags that looked like contractor gear, the kind of thing that didn't read as surveillance if someone glanced at it from distance. Artoria was waiting at the northeast corner of the secondary block, exactly where the schematic showed the camera blind spot. She had not moved from the position in 70 minutes. When they arrived, she assessed the group in a single pass and said, 6 guards on the interior, 2 at the main entry, 4 cycling the perimeter. The pattern is 18 minutes. "You've been counting their rotation," MM said. "Since 1800. He nodded. "Interior layout. 2 corridors. 41 people based on movement and sound. 1 guard per corridor, 2 at the corridor junction." Frenchie pulled out his phone, no signal as expected, and switched to the offline schematic. "The sub-level access is here south end. Annie's team needs 12 minutes inside to pull everything." "Then we give them 15, Artoria said. "To account for what we have not anticipated." MM looked at the block, at the thin strip of light under the main entry door, at the camera arc overhead. He'd run operations in worse conditions. He'd also run operations in better ones, and the honest difference between those 2 categories was often less about skill and more about what went wrong first. "The cleanup team," he said. Annie said 90 minutes. 60 now, Frenchie said, checking his watch. "Then we move." The interior of the secondary block smelled like every detention facility MM had ever been inside, which was a specific combination of industrial cleaner and institutional meals and the particular staleness of recycled air that never quite moved. The lights were on low nighttime protocol, and the 2 guards in the main corridor went down fast and quiet Artoria, moving through the space like she was reading a map she'd already memorized. She didn't break anything. Both guards were seated against the wall, zip-tied with their own restraints before the nearest detainee in the first corridor had fully registered what was happening. MM noted it: operational economy 0 excess, no performance. Frenchie took the junction guards while Artoria cleared the entry. The recording crew split and went south toward the sub-level access. MM started moving down the first corridor, checking cells, counting faces. 38. Not 41. 3 unaccounted, he said quietly into the comm. Frenchie's voice. "Second corridor checking." A pause. "Not here," Frenchie said. "MM, they already moved 3. MM filed it and kept going. 38 was 38. He started opening cell doors, keeping his voice low and steady. You need to move. Single file, quiet, follow the person in front of you. No talking until we're outside the fence. Most of them moved. One woman in the third cell didn't. She was seated against the back wall with the specific flatness of someone who had been inside long enough to stop trusting that movement meant improvement. He crouched down to her level. I know, he said. I know. But we have about 50 minutes before this gets significantly worse, and I need you to trust me for 50 minutes. She got up. At 2023, the cleanup team arrived early. Not Vought security contractors, the kind that showed up in unmarked vehicles with equipment cases and no identifiable insignia. The kind whose employment contracts had clauses that precluded discussing assignments with anyone, including family members, and whose rate structure reflected the premium for that discretion. 3 vehicles Eastern Service Road, and they had their own schematic, because of course they did. Annie 2 miles out in a moving car with a tablet running the camp's exterior camera feed through a hacked relay. Watched the vehicles stop at the service road entrance and felt the timing compress. She hit the comm. They're early. You have maybe 20 minutes, not 50. MM's voice flat. How many bats? 12 that I can see, probably more. They have a drone up. A beat. Then Artoria's voice, which Annie had come to recognize as the voice of someone who had already updated their calculation and was operating on the new version, the sub-level team. How much time do they need? 8 more minutes, Annie said. Then hold the service road for 8 minutes. There are 12 of them. Yes, Artoria said, as if this were a logistical detail, rather than an objection. Kike, the contractors moved in a standard 2-element formation. Entry team and cover element, which was professional and would have been sufficient against anything in their experience. Their briefing had described the target as a single enhanced individual, sword-armed, capable of deflecting standard ballistic. The briefing had also described her as isolated and without support. That second part had been wrong. The first 2-man element reached the northeast corner at 2027 and found MM waiting. MM was not the variable they'd been briefed on. What followed was not a firefight. It was a sequence of rapid, unglamorous decisions: disarm, control, neutralize, move. Frenchie came in from the service road flank. Artoria held the gap in the fence, and the contractors who reached her one at a time, because the terrain funneled them, and each one was dealt with in the same fashion as the ones before disarmed. Grounded zip-tied with their own gear left where they fell. No one died. That was a choice she was making in real time, recalculating after each engagement, and it cost her seconds she was paying with precision. At 2029, the drone found her. It was a small unit camera and speaker, the kind used for perimeter surveillance and remote command. It broadcast a voice. Stand down. Lethal force is authorized. This is your only warning. She looked up at it. Around her, the remaining contractors had pulled back to regroup at the service road. The people inside need 3 more minutes. MM said through the comm. She calculated the geometry. The service road was the choke point. If she held it for 3 minutes, the recording team finished and the extraction completed. The contractors would call for support. Support would arrive. What she needed was not to win the engagement. What she needed was to make it expensive enough for long enough. And then she heard Annie's voice. They're rigging the sub-level. I've got a feed from the team inside. They found an incendiary setup. Remote trigger. If Vought activates it, the sub-level goes and everything in it burns. 3 minutes was no longer the variable. She stepped into the center of the service road. She thought about the line, the specific geometry of it, the structures she needed to open, and the ones she needed to leave intact, the corridor she needed to cut through the camp's eastern perimeter wall wide enough for 38 people to move through quickly. She measured it. 40 meters of perimeter wall, the eastern guard tower, the relay box that fed power to the sublevel's incendiary circuit. The sword was no longer sheathed in wind. The blade caught the floodlight and held it. She called its name. The beam was not wide. That was the first thing MM registered from his position at the secondary block's exit. Not an explosion, not a wave, but a line of light that moved with the precision of something aimed rather than released. It crossed the 40 meters of perimeter wall in under a second, taking stone and concrete along a specific path, opening a corridor exactly wide enough to pass through. It caught the guard tower at the joint between the tower's base and its mounting platform. Not the tower itself. The mount failed, and the structure dropped sideways away from the corridor without collapsing into the exit path. The relay box ceased to exist. In the sub-level 3 members of Annie's documentation team looked up from their equipment as the lights went red and the incendiary circuit went dead. The lead documentarian, a woman named Carla, who had been doing this work for 6 years, checked her equipment, confirmed the recording was intact, and said, "We're done. Move." The corridor was open. MM moved the 38 people through it in just under 4 minutes, which was slower than ideal and faster than it should have been possible given the conditions. Frenchie ran the rear. The contractors regrouped at the service road, held position rather than re-engaging their authorization extended to the facility. And outside the facility line, they were in a legal and tactical gray area their contract language hadn't addressed. The last person through the corridor was a man who had been inside for 19 days and who stopped at the gap to look back at the block he'd spent those days in. M put a hand on his shoulder and kept moving. Artoria stood in the service road for a moment after the last person cleared the corridor. The floodlights were out on the eastern side. The guard tower was down. The perimeter wall had a corridor in it. 38 people had just walked through. She looked at what Excalibur had taken and what it had left standing, and she found the accounting acceptable. Then she walked through the corridor and did not look back. Vaught's official statement went out at 2290 minutes after the breach. An armed extremist with confirmed ties to anti-government terrorist networks launched a coordinated attack on a federal public safety facility tonight, destroying critical security infrastructure and enabling the escape of dangerous individuals being held under emergency executive authority. The individual previously identified as a foreign asset has now demonstrated the capacity for large-scale destruction of federal property. Vought International is cooperating fully with federal authorities. Homelander has been personally briefed and has assumed direct operational command of the response. The Resistance Network's counter-release went out at 22:15:47 seconds of sub-level documentation footage, raw and unedited, showing the incendiary rigging and the Vought logistics manifest for the cleanup team. It was distributed through 11 channels simultaneously. 4 were pulled within the hour. 7 held. By midnight, the footage had been viewed 2 million times. By 1 a.m., Vaught's legal team had filed injunctions against the remaining 7 channels. By 2 a.m., the injunctions had been reported on by 3 news organizations as the story, not the footage, but the attempt to suppress the footage, which was a kind of accidental victory that Annie had not planned for and was not certain how long it would hold. She was in a car on E95 going south when Butcher called. "Footage is out," he said. "Vaught's suppressing it. Homelander's taking personal command." A pause. "Your play worked better than I expected." "It worked enough," she said. "Not all the way. 3 people they moved before we got there." "Yes." Another pause longer. "I still have the bag." "I know. Next time they move someone, "There won't be a next time like this," she said, "because we have the footage, and we have 38 people who can talk." She kept her voice even. "Give me 72 hours to build the case before you do anything." Silence on the line. "72 hours, he said finally. "Then we're having a different conversation." He hung up. Outside, the highway ran south through the dark, and somewhere behind her, a camp had a corridor in its eastern wall and a sub-level with a dead incendiary circuit. And Homelander had just taken personal command of the response, which meant the next move was his, and it would be designed to hit something that couldn't deflect it. He had told her at a checkpoint on Route 40 that he'd found the one thing about her he intended to use. She had been in a warehouse in the Port District when he said it, and she hadn't been there to hear it. But Annie had, and Annie had told her, and she had been thinking about it since the way he'd filed the information about the minivan. The calculation behind it, the architecture of a threat that didn't need to be stated to be real. The 41 had become 38. 3 were somewhere without a public record, and Homelander had just been handed a national security mandate and a personal grievance. 72 hours. She started counting. The executive order came down at 6 a.m., and by 7 it was infrastructure. Curfew in 5 Maryland counties, 8 in Virginia. All public gatherings of more than 12 persons required advance permit approval from the Office of Homeland Security, which had been reorganized 3 weeks ago and now reported to a deputy who reported to someone who had Homelander's direct line. Checkpoints on 43 routes in and out of the Baltimore metro area. Vaught's aerial surveillance program, previously operating under a temporary federal contract, was granted permanent expanded authority with a single paragraph of legislative language attached to an appropriations bill that had passed at 2 in the morning with no floor debate. VNN ran the order as breaking news. The chyron read, "Homelander takes command. Emergency measures to protect American safety, full authority granted." The Resistance Network lost 4 safe houses in the first 6 hours. Not rated compromised, which was worse because it meant the people who had been inside them were now variables in an equation Annie couldn't fully account for. She moved everyone she could reach and accepted that she couldn't reach all of them, which was the kind of acceptance that sat in the chest like a weight you stopped noticing because noticing it didn't help. By noon, the Vought tip line had received 11,000 calls. By 2 p.m., a man in a Pikesville neighborhood had been detained after his neighbor reported seeing a woman in unusual clothing near his garage. The woman had been his daughter visiting from out of state. Vought security held him for 4 hours before releasing him without explanation. His name was Dennis Watts, and he was 53 years old, and he had never been involved in anything, and now he had a file. This was also part of the plan. Not Homelander's plan specifically, it was the plan that systems like this executed automatically without needing instruction because the machinery of mass surveillance generates its own momentum once you give it authorization and a target demographic. Annie read about Dennis Watts in a field report and thought this is what it looks like when it spreads. Butcher called at 14:30 from a number she didn't recognize, which meant he'd swapped again, which meant he was moving. 3 distribution points. He said no preamble. Eastern approach North Industrial, the water treatment relay. Winds right tonight. The 72 hours isn't up, she said. Vought just picked up 2 of the people from the secondary block extraction. The ones who didn't make the cars in time. His voice was flat, which was how his voice got when he'd already processed his anger and was operating on the residue. They've been inside since 0400. Vought Medical has them. She pressed her hand to the wall. Where to? Facility in Bethesda. Private, no public record. The kind of place where under observation means whatever they need it to mean. A pause. Your case won't get them out. Your 72 hours won't get them out. My 3 distribution points will. Your 3 distribution points will kill everyone in a 2-mile radius who's running any V derivative, and that includes approximately 400 civilians in the North Industrial Area alone. Then they should have thought about that before Vought put the water supply in the ground. She breathed. Billy, I'm not waiting on paperwork while they run experiments on 2 people who trusted us to get them out. I know it, she said. I know that. Give me until tonight. I have something in motion. The line was quiet long enough that she thought he'd hung up. Tonight, he said. If it's not resolved by 2200, I move. He ended the call. What she had in motion was a name, Marcus Webb, a Vought internal compliance officer who had been feeding information to a journalist network for 14 months and who had 2 days ago forwarded a document that described the Bethesda facility and its current population. The document was not admissible in any court that Vought had influence over. It was, however, specific enough to act on. She reached Webb through a cutout and gave him one instruction: confirm the 2 names and get a location within the facility. He came back in 40 minutes. 3rd floor East Wing medical observation. 2 guards per room, no external windows, access through a keycard system that updated every 6 hours. She relayed the layout to Artoria through a contact point they'd established after the warehouse meeting, a particular chalk mark on a specific wall in East Baltimore that Artoria checked twice daily, which was a method of communication so analog that it didn't appear in any of Vaught's monitoring protocols. Because Vaught's monitoring protocols had been designed by people who assumed all meaningful communication was digital. The chalk mark said Bethesda. Tonight. 2 people. She got a mark back within the hour. It said, "What time is the key card cycle?" She sent the answer. She got nothing back which she had learned to read as confirmation. The Bethesda facility was a converted office building in a commercial district that looked from the outside like a biotech company in the middle of its 3rd rebranding. Artoria arrived at 1900 and spent 40 minutes reading the building entry points, guard patterns, the maintenance access on the north side that wasn't on the public building permits, the camera arc over the east entrance that had a gap at the corner where the wall met the parking structure. 2 people. 3rd floor, East Wing. She went in through the maintenance access at 1950, which was 10 minutes before the keycard cycle updated, which was the window Webb had identified. The guards she encountered in the stairwell were private security, not military, different training, different response pattern, same result. She put them against the wall and kept moving. 3rd floor was quieter than she'd expected. 1 guard at the East Wing junction, 1 per room as described. She worked through it in sequence, and the sequence took 11 minutes, and when she came out of the 2nd room, she had 2 people behind her who were not in good condition but were mobile. The extraction went through the maintenance access and into a car that Annie had positioned on the service street behind the parking structure. The driver was a man named Torres who asked no questions and drove south. Artoria walked away from the building in a direction that did not correspond to where the car went because they had agreed that her presence and the car's presence should not be associated in any surveillance record. She was 3 blocks west when her comm activated. Annie's voice tighter than usual. Homelander knows about the extraction. I don't know how internal leak, or they had the facility watched after the camp, or both. He's calling it a 2nd attack on federal medical infrastructure. A beat. He's going live at 2100. What kind of live? The kind with cameras and a location and a hostage. The broadcast started at 2100 on the dot, because Homelander understood that precision was its own form of power. It signaled control. It signaled preparation. It signaled that the person doing it had decided in advance how things would go. He was standing on the roof of Vought Tower. Behind him, the city. In his right hand, the collar of a man Artoria did not recognize, held at the building's edge, with the specific negligence of someone who had decided that gravity was something that applied to other people. "I've been patient," Homelander said. He was using his broadcast voice, the one calibrated for living rooms and phone screens. "I gave her every opportunity to come forward, to explain herself, to act like someone who has any interest in the safety of the people she claims to protect." He looked down at the man he was holding, then back at the camera. "His name is Carl Bowen. He drove the car that took 2 federal detainees from a lawful medical facility tonight. That makes him a material accessory to terrorism." He raised Carl Bowen slightly, the way you'd raise a prop, to make sure the camera caught it. "I'm going to give her 30 minutes to present herself at Vought Plaza. If she doesn't, well, Carl's going to have a long night." He looked directly into the camera. "She cares about people she can't afford to care about," he said. "That's the thing about her. I figured that out at a checkpoint 3 days ago. And that's the thing about caring. It's a handle. Once I've got it, I can take you anywhere I want." The broadcast cut to a VNN anchor who began discussing the ongoing standoff with the vocabulary of someone who had decided or been told that Homelander's framing was the frame. Annie watched the broadcast from a car outside the building where Torres had taken the 2 recovered detainees. She watched it twice. Then she called MM. "He's not going to drop Carl Bowen," she said. "Dropping him live on camera would give us footage that's too clean it would look like what it is. He needs her to show up so he can make the confrontation the story. So what do? We make sure she doesn't walk in blind." She pulled up the Vought Plaza schematics. She'd had them since month 2 of the operation, because you prepared for the building you'd eventually need to be in. Sniper positions here and here. Drone coverage from the north. He'll have a camera crew, and he'll have 2 or 3 heavy assets as backup, because he'll want witnesses to whatever happens. She paused. "The cameras are the point. He wants the whole country watching her lose. And if she doesn't lose," Annie considered this, "then he makes sure the broadcast doesn't show that." She forwarded the schematics through the chalk mark relay, a photograph this time taken and left in a specific location. She added 1 line of text below the image. "He doesn't want to win. He wants to perform winning. The cameras are the target." She didn't know if it reached Artoria in time. She didn't know if Artoria would agree with the assessment. What she knew was that the Carl Bowen was on the roof of Vought Tower and 30 minutes was running, and Butcher's 2200 deadline was 3 hours out, and the 72 hours had become irrelevant the moment Homelander picked up a camera crew and a hostage. The system had, as it always did, found the pressure point and pressed. MM spoke from somewhere on the other side of the line. "She goes in knowing this is a trap." "Yes, and she goes anyway." "The man on the roof is real," Annie said. "That's the thing about the trap. The hostage is always real." She hung up. She thought about Butcher and his bag and his deadline. And she thought about 38 people who had walked through a corridor in an eastern perimeter wall. And she thought about 2 people in a car going south with a driver who asked no questions. The accounting never balanced. That was the permanent condition of this kind of work. You moved the numbers around, and you called it progress. And you kept going because the alternative to keeping going was letting the numbers move on their own. She started driving toward Vought Plaza, not to help. She had no way to help with what was about to happen on that roof. She drove because someone needed to be there to document what came after, and because documentation was the only weapon she had left that Homelander couldn't deflect with his bare hands. Butcher texted at 21:20. 3 words, clock is running. She didn't respond. She drove. Vought Plaza had been dressed for the occasion, the way Vought dressed everything with a precision that looked spontaneous. The camera rigs had gone up at 1,706 of them on elevated platforms around the plaza's perimeter, plus a drone array running a coverage pattern that ensured no angle of the central space would be unrecorded. The crowd barriers had been positioned to channel spectators into a viewing area that put them close enough to feel included and far enough back to be safe from the specific category of events that Vought's risk assessment had flagged as possible. The banner on the VNN live feed read, "Homelander delivers justice live, watch now." Carl Bowen was on a raised platform at the plaza's center, wrists secured under the lights. He was a 51-year-old man who drove cars when resistance networks needed cars driven. And he was on a platform in front of 300 people and 6 camera rigs. Because Homelander had identified him as the most useful kind of hostage anonymous, enough to be disposable, present enough to be real. The crowd numbered roughly 300, a mix Vought had cultivated through 3 days of targeted social media people who wanted to see justice, delivered people who were frightened and wanted the frightening thing dealt with, people who had been convinced by a week of continuous broadcast that the woman in armor was the origin of their fear rather than a symptom of its cause. A smaller cluster stood at the barrier's far edge, holding handwritten signs. Security personnel had positioned themselves between the 2 groups, with the practiced neutrality of people paid to prevent a particular kind of footage from being captured. At 21:15, Homelander descended from above. Slow, deliberate, the landing time to coincide with a break in the ambient noise that Vought's sound team had engineered by cutting the plaza's music feed 6 seconds prior. He stood at the platform's edge and let the crowd respond, and then he raised one hand, and the crowd went quiet, and that sequence land wait. Command silence was something he'd been doing for years, and it still worked. Since it was designed to work, since crowds respond to certainty, the way plants respond to light, not through deliberate choice, but through the simple sufficiency of the stimulus. 3 days ago, he said, a terrorist walked into an American facility and destroyed it. Last night, she broke into a medical building and took 2 people who were receiving care. He didn't look at Carl Bowen. He looked at the cameras rotating through them with the instinct of someone who had internalized every lens angle in the space. Tonight, I'm going to show you what this country does with people who think they're above the law. He turned to the crowd, and his expression shifted into the particular configuration that VNN's analysts had described in internal memos as compassionate authority, grief, and resolve, the face of someone who hurt because the situation required hurting and was prepared to do what the situation demanded. She cares, he said. That's her problem. She cares about people who are going to get her killed. He looked at Carl Bowen for the first time, and people who are going to get other people killed. Annie was in a utility van on the plaza's eastern service street with Frenchie Huey and 2 members of the documentation team. She had been watching the live feed on a tablet and running the timing against the coverage gaps she'd identified in the drone array. There's a 30-second window in the northwest corner every 4 minutes when the primary drone rotates, Frenchie said. If she comes in from that direction, she won't come from a direction they're not watching, said. She'll come from the direction they are watching. That's how she operates. Huey was looking at the live feed. He's going to kill Carl Bowen on camera. He's going to threaten to kill Carl Bowen on camera, Annie said. There's a difference. Dead hostages end the leverage. He wants her to show up, not to prove he'll do it. And if she doesn't show... Annie didn't answer that. The feed was still running Homelander at the platform the crowd arranged around him. The drone array turning its slow coverage pattern overhead. She was watching the northwest corner, "Frenchie," she said. "The signal jammer. The one that hits Vaught's drone uplink." 30 seconds of coverage blackout, then they switched to backup frequency. "Get ready." She watched the feed. Not yet. She came in from the north entrance. Not the northwest, not any of the angles Frenchie had mapped. The north entrance straight down the central approach, walking the way she had walked across a camp yard 11 days ago. Without hurry, without evasion, each step placed with the deliberateness of someone who had decided where they were going and saw no reason to obscure it. The crowd registered her before the cameras did. A ripple moved through the 300 people. Not panic, not quite, but the specific tension of a space, recalibrating around a new variable. The camera rigs swung to track her. The drone array adjusted. She wore the armor. She had not attempted to conceal it because concealment would have suggested she was there for subtlety, and she was not there for subtlety. She was there because a man was on a platform with his wrists secured, and a crowd of 300 people had been assembled to watch something happen to him. And she had read that situation from the moment Annie forwarded the schematics, and she had made her decision then. Homelander watched her approach with the expression of someone whose plan was executing correctly. He wanted her to come. She was coming. In his calculation, the next several minutes were scripted. She stopped 20 feet from the platform. "Release him," she said. One sentence. No elaboration. Homelander smiled the broadcast smile, the one calibrated for the camera angle to his left. "There she is," he said. "Finally decided to show up." He looked at the crowd, then back at her. "You know what I find interesting? You could have stayed hidden. You could have let Carl here have a bad night and moved on. But you didn't." He tilted his head. "Because you can't. Because caring is a reflex for you, not a choice. And reflexes..." He gestured at the cameras, the crowd, the 6 rigs, capturing every angle. Reflexes can be exploited. The crowd was very still. "Walk away," she said. Second sentence. Still no elaboration. He fired the heat vision without telegraphing it. No wind-up, no posture shift. The kind of attack designed to land before the target registered it was coming. Tight beam center mass. The wind barrier took it. The deflection scored the plaza stone 4 feet to her right. And she was already inside his reach by the time the crowd processed the sound. What followed took less time than the crowd could track. Invisible air shaped to a point drove into the joint of his right shoulder, not cutting, not piercing, a concentrated pressure impact that disrupted the shoulder's structural integrity without penetrating. His right arm dropped. The heat vision ceased. He was fast. He reached with his left hand, and she redirected it the same economical motion she had used in a sub-level 11 days ago, taking the momentum and converting it rather than absorbing it. He hit the platform's surface instead of her. He was up in under a second. She knew he would be. She had the sword out. Not Excalibur, not the release, not the beam. The blade itself, the steel brought up in a single motion and held at the angle that put the edge against the armor plating at his throat before he completed the movement of rising. The wind sheath gave the blade's edge a precision that standard steel did not carry. He stopped. The cameras were still running. All 6 rigs, the drone array, the phones in the crowd, all of it, recording a man who could burn a road with his eyes, holding absolutely still, because there was a sword at his throat, and the person holding it had not moved an inch since she placed it there. She held it for 3 seconds. She was not going to kill him on camera with the crowd watching. She had made that decision before she entered the plaza, and not because she lacked the capacity, because the image of a sword point execution in front of 300 people was a story Vought could use for a decade, the terrorist, the unprovoked, killing the martyr. Because the goal was not his death. The goal was Carl Bowen off the platform and the crowd understanding what they had just seen. She stepped back. One step. The blade came down. "Tell them," she said. He looked at her. The broadcast composure had fractured across one side of his face. Not gone entirely, but cracked in the specific way of a performance interrupted by something the performer hadn't written. "Tell them what you built this place into," she said. "Or I come back." She turned away from him. She crossed to the platform, cut Carl Bowen's restraints. With a single precise stroke, steadied the man with one hand, until he had his feet and walked him toward the crowd barrier. Behind her, Homelander was standing in the center of the plaza with a cracked shoulder assembly and 6 cameras still running, and 300 people who had just watched him hold still for a sword. He opened his mouth. What came out was not the broadcast voice. Frenchie hit the drone uplink jammer at 2143. 30 seconds of blackout on the primary array. In those 30 seconds, Annie's documentation team broadcast 41 seconds of raw plaza footage, unedited, from 3 independent civilian phones that had been positioned in the crowd before the event, to the Resistance Network's 11 distribution channels simultaneously. The VNN feed cut to technical difficulties at 2144. It came back at 2145, with a Chiron developing situation at Vought Plaza, details emerging. By 2150, the raw footage had been viewed 800,000 times across the channels that were still up. By 2200, Vaught's legal team was processing injunctions against 7 of them. By 2230, the injunction filings themselves had been screenshotted and distributed, and 3 journalists who had been in the plaza crowd were filing copy to outlets that Vought did not have existing relationships with. At 2215, Vaught's official statement went out. Tonight, Homelander was attacked without provocation by a foreign terrorist asset at a lawful public event. He sustained injuries consistent with an assault by an enhanced individual. Vought International condemns this act of political violence in the strongest possible terms and confirms that Homelander is receiving medical attention. The search for the individual responsible has been elevated to the highest federal priority. The statement did not mention Carl Bowen, who was in Annie's van by then drinking water, not speaking. It did not mention that Homelander had been standing at a sword point and had not moved for 3 seconds in front of 6 camera rigs. It did not need to. Everyone who had seen the footage knew what they had seen. The question, the permanent, intractable question, was whether knowing was sufficient. Butcher called at 2240. He had been watching the feed from wherever he was, which Annie had not been able to determine for the past 6 hours. His voice carried the specific quality of a man revising a position he hadn't expected to need to revise. "He's not dead," Butcher said. "No." "She had him." "Yes." A pause. "Why didn't she?" Annie watched the plaza through the van's side window. The crowd dispersing in 2 directions, the security personnel trying to manage the separation. The camera rigs being dismantled by Vaught's crew, who had received instructions to pull the equipment before independent journalists could establish that it had been there. Because killing him on camera in front of 300 people is the one outcome Vought could weaponize indefinitely, she said. He dies, he's a martyr. The system replaces him with something worse and has a story to justify anything it does. So he lives. He lives with 300 witnesses and 41 seconds of footage showing him hold still for a sword. She paused. That's not nothing. It's not enough. I know. Another silence. She could hear him breathing and working something through. The bag, he said finally. Billy, not tonight. I'm not saying tonight." He cut her off before she could continue. "But Homelander's out of commission for 3 days a week, and Vought's going to put something in the gap. They always put something in the gap. And whatever they put there is going to need dealing with." His voice was even, which was the register he used when he'd arrived at a conclusion and was informing people of it. "I'll hold. For now. But this isn't over." "It's never over," she said. "That's not a reason to burn it down." He hung up. She found the chalk mark at 2330 on a wall in East Baltimore. Just one line left an hour ago by the shape of the mark, heading east. The system remains. So do I. Annie stood at the wall for a moment. Around her, the city continued delivery schedules and traffic patterns, and people going home from late shifts, and people who had watched the plaza footage on their phones and were processing what it meant, and people who hadn't seen it, and people who had seen Vaught's version, and people who had no opinion and just needed the morning to come. She took a photograph of the mark and sent it to MM without a message. He sent back, "Copy," and then done. Homelander was in a Vought medical facility in Midtown Manhattan. By midnight, his shoulder under assessment, his communications being managed by a team of 4 who were very good at their jobs. The preliminary damage evaluation indicated the joint would require 3 to 4 weeks of accelerated recovery. His personal phone had been secured by security personnel within 11 minutes of the Plaza event, which was protocol, and the last thing he had typed on it before that happened was a message to a contact that read, "Find her." The contact would relay it. The search would continue. The search had resources and infrastructure and 11,000 tips in a database and a federal mandate and everything, except the specific knowledge of where she was going. She was going east, not because there was a destination. The problem she had walked into 11 days ago through a Vought sub-level was not the camp and not the man on the platform and not the bag in Butcher's possession. The problem was the architecture, the way a system builds a Homelander, since it needs one, since a Homelander is useful. The alternative being something equally frightening on someone else's side. She had seen that architecture before. She had lived inside it. She had watched it fail in ways that still had not finished failing in a kingdom that was still collapsing in slow motion across the centuries. Its wreckage visible in every place that power had decided it was more important than the people it was meant to serve. She did not know what she would find going east. She knew what she was looking for. The next place where people were being held under a law that served the holder rather than the held the next door that needed opening, the next accounting that wasn't going to do itself. The city fell away behind her. The highway opened up. The dark was complete enough that the only light was what the road reflected back. She started walking. And she did not look back, and the cameras of the city that was still running behind her recorded nothing but an empty road.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss our future video. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.